Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 weapon tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're looking at polearms. For tens of thousands of years prior to the proliferation of firearms, this was the most widely used and most lethal kind of weapon in human history, but they're often weirdly overlooked in fantasy games. Baldur's Gate 3 actually kind of bucks that trend and avoids that trap, with some of the most powerful weapons in the game belonging to this category. Today we're looking at glaives, halberds, pikes, and spears, in other words, the weapons that can be used with the polearm master feat, although you don't need that feat in order to use these weapons. In fact, because spears are versatile and the others are two-handed, nearly every martial character in the game will be considering weapons from this category, so it's a very important category of weapon to understand because they are so widely used by so many different characters. Just as with my previous weapon and item tier lists, I'm going to be rating these weapons based on their strength at the point in the game at which you acquire them. In other words, when you pick up this weapon, is it better than the equipment you already have access to, and should you use it? In S tier, I'm going to be placing weapons that are best in slot for a wide variety of builds or specific, extremely powerful builds. In A tier, weapons that make interesting alternatives to the S tier weapons by enabling a unique strategy or being really good in certain kinds of encounters. In B tier, weapons that enable sort of unusual or off-meta parties, or have a unique strategy that's maybe less powerful than the other strategies, but still something really interesting, or ones that are useful in a couple encounters throughout the game. In C tier, items that still have uses and you can technically get value out of them, but are usually overshadowed by other options. And in D tier, weapons that you can pretty safely avoid because most parties will simply have better access to other stuff available. I'm going to start by discussing the unique weapon actions of each of these four types of weapons, and their uses as their non-magical versions. If you're not interested in learning about the weapon actions, feel free to skip ahead to the Jagged Spear, which will be the first unique magical item that we cover here, but I will say that the unique weapon actions and properties of each of these items are part of what makes them so powerful, so I do recommend sticking around. Glaives are a two-handed reach weapon, so they can only be used in two hands, and unlike normal melee weapons, which allow you to attack up to 5 feet away, glaives allow you to attack up to 8 feet away. That means that characters using reach weapons control a lot more of the battlefield. It is funny that they decided to go with 8 feet. In Dungeons & Dragons, reach weapons can hit up to 10 feet away, so I don't know why they shaved 2 feet off of them, but in Baldur's Gate 3, it's 8 feet of radius around your character. In addition to the reach property of glaives, they also have 3 weapon actions available to them. The first is Rush Attack, which lets you, as a standard action, move up to 30 feet, and then deal 1d4 plus your normal strength modifier in damage to the first enemy that you encounter. That's quite useful, Rush Attack, because it lets you effectively dash and attack in the same round, in the same action, in the same turn. So you can get a lot more mobility when you're armed with a weapon with Rush Attack, and it means that your characters spend many fewer turns just staring at enemies or making ineffectual ranged attacks. Characters armed with this kind of weapon are often controlling characters that want to be next to ranged or squishy enemies in order to make them as sad as possible, so the ability to do that more easily is invaluable in some fights. They also have Lacerate, which we've talked about in some previous tier lists, which lets you, once per short rest, do a normal attack that also makes the enemy bleed. Bleeding is an okay ability to apply, an okay condition to apply, gives enemies disadvantage on constitution saves and does a little damage, but Lacerate I think overall is one of the weaker weapon actions. But they also come with Brace, which lets you spend 20 feet of your movement speed, so no action associated with this, just costs you a little bit of movement speed, and then for the rest of your turn, you re-roll your melee damage. You roll twice and take the higher. This works on all melee damage that you roll dice for that round. So if you're a paladin smiting, for example, it's going to let you re-roll your smite damage, and any additional dice that you're adding to your weapon attacks, it'll let you re-roll. So not only does it make your damage much higher, it also makes it much more consistent and lets you plan your turns much better. So Brace is one of the best weapon actions out there. overall, I think that gives glaives a pretty solid set of weapon actions and a pretty nice property. Just being a reach weapon is pretty good. They're also just a d10 damage die, which isn't bad. It's lower than some other two-handed weapons, but the weapon actions that they get are pretty nice. And so early in the game, I think that glaives are fine. That being said, they are overshadowed by some of the other weapon actions that we are going to talk about with these other non-magical weapons, so I'm still going to give them D tier, but that's just because some of these other weapons have better actions. Halberds are identical to glaives in terms of stats. They do 1d10 base damage and are two-handed reach weapons, and they also have rush attack and lacerate. The difference between these weapons is that halberds trade brace out for cleave. Cleave allows you to attack up to 3 enemies in an arc, doing half of your normal damage to each of them. When you get this weapon as a non-magical weapon, I'd much rather have brace. Because it halves your damage, you need to hit 3 enemies in order for that weapon action to do more damage than just a normal weapon attack, whereas brace is always going to be useful, so only in very specific configurations of enemies will the non-magical halberd's cleave attack actually be good. Cleave does get much better later in the game, and some of the later game halberds, the cleave will be extremely relevant, because importantly, while it halves your weapon damage, it doesn't have base damage effects, flat damage effects that are added on top of your weapon damage. For example, a barbarian's rage bonus isn't halved, and importantly, the plus 10 bonus from the Great Weapon Master feat isn't halved. So cleave will end up being a very relevant weapon action later on. But at the point where you're choosing between non-magical weapons, the halberd is slightly worse than the glaive, which I already gave D tier, so is also going to go into D tier. Pikes share a very similar stat line, with 1d10 damage and 8 feet of reach. I will say that the 8 feet of reach is even sillier for pikes than for these other weapons, because while lots and lots of different kinds of weapons have been historically called pikes, they were almost all minimum 12 feet in length, and there's historical examples up to like 24, 28 feet long. So for this thing to only have 8 feet of reach, you've got to be holding it right up near the tip, and you have 20 feet of pike just swinging out behind you while you're fighting, which makes for a very silly image. In-game, they have rush attack and brace, just like glaives, but trade out lacerate for piercing strike. Piercing strike inflicts gaping wounds, which causes enemies to take 2 extra damage from all sources of damage, from you and your allies for 2 turns, and is therefore just way better than lacerate as a weapon action. This is maybe the best combination of weapon actions in the game from pikes. Rush attack is very useful in a variety of situations, brace makes your damage wildly more consistent when you need it to, and piercing strike is just always very good. So pike's weapon actions are excellent. Any weapon with the base model of a pike is going to be able to do relevant things every single turn of combat because they've got really good weapon actions to spend. Non-magical pikes aren't available super early, no character starts with them, but if you do happen to find one when you're still using non-magical weapons, then you might upgrade to it, because it's going to be one of the best possible non-magical weapons available. So I'm going to go ahead and give pikes C tier, because while of course you'll swap as soon as you get good magical weapons, a pike is one of the best base weapon models, so if you're using non-magical weapons, then it's quite possibly the one that you're going for. Spears are versatile weapons, so can be either used one-handed for a d6 of damage, or two-handed for a d8 of damage. They're also simple weapons, so they only require a simple weapon proficiency. The other weapons on this list are all martial weapons and need martial weapon proficiency. Spears are notable for 2 reasons. 1, they do a d8 of damage as a simple weapon if wielded in 2 hands, which is the most damage that a character with only simple weapon proficiency can do right at the start of the game. A spear dipped in fire is a d8 plus a d4 of damage, so just like a quarterstaff, which I talked about in the staffs section, this might be the highest damage output setup available if your character only has simple weapon proficiency in the very beginning of the game. However, unlike a quarterstaff, no character starts with a spear, so you will very rarely actually be using this feature of spears, so that doesn't matter in particular. Spears are also thrown weapons, and have the rush attack weapon action. That's their only weapon action. And because they are thrown weapons, they're always at least moderately interesting. Every character should try to carry some weapons with the thrown weapon. Every strength character should try to carry some weapons with the thrown weapon property so that they have access to a decent ranged attack on turns where they can't get into range of an enemy. Because strength characters are going to do better with thrown weapons than with a bow in a lot of situations, so you should stockpile a few weapons with the thrown weapon property in order to chuck at enemies. It's also important for throwing weapon characters because there's a bug where if you throw a returning weapon at an enemy before combat starts, it won't come back. So throwing weapon characters need a stockpile of not their main weapon if they want to initiate combat. That being said, Spear is not one of the best ones for this property because it's a non-magical weapon, and so you'll probably be using hand axes and stuff like that instead because they're lighter and you start with them rather than actually collecting non-magical spears. They do have some usage, so I'm going to give them C tier, but again, these are mostly overshadowed by better options in every category that you would be interested in using a non-magical spear in. The +1 versions of these weapons are identical, except with +1 to attack and damage, and they're available randomly from merchants right from the beginning of the game. However, for the +1 Glaive, Halberd, and Pike, there's no reason to buy these from merchants, because if you're buying a weapon from an early game merchant, the returning Pike, which is a strictly superior version of a +1 Pike, the best of these weapons, is available from a very early game merchant, so you should just buy that instead. For that reason, these are all D tier, because a strictly better version of this weapon is available from pretty much the same point in the game. +1 spears are more interesting because they are thrown weapons, and I already talked about why you want a stockpile of weapons with the thrown weapon property for throwing weapon characters. +1 thrown weapons are even better because they do 1 more damage when thrown, so they make an even better emergency backup option for a strength character to throw, or initiating combat option for a character who's using throwing weapons. That being said, again, I don't think that spears are the best of these. I prefer hand axes or javelins. Those spears are totally fine, mostly just because of the weight. But it's still totally reasonable to pick up +1 spears, so I'm going to give them B tier. And the first of the unique magical weapons, the Jagged Spear. The Jagged Spear is a magical spear, but without any enhancement bonus, so attacks and does damage exactly the same as a normal spear. When you hit an enemy with it, they have to make a DC 10 Charisma save or become tortured. Tortured is a unique condition for this weapon, but all it does is apply disadvantage to Constitution saving throws, so it's basically the same as bleed or slightly worse because bleeding also inflicts 2 damage every turn. So it's not the most exciting condition in the world. That being said, inflicting a saving throw against a condition every single attack is always at least somewhat interesting in Baldur's Gate because so many other items scale off of inflicting conditions. Things like radiating orbs or reverberation can be applied when you inflict a condition on an enemy, and this is one way to do it. That said, a DC 10 Charisma save, even though it targets a good saving throw, is still not very reliable, so this won't go off every turn. And for the most part, if you want to give an enemy disadvantage on Constitution saving throws, then just using the Lacerate weapon action from any weapon is going to be a better way of doing it, or there's lots of ways to apply bleeding without a saving throw at all, using one of the bleeding grenades, for example. There are some enemies that are immune to bleeding, and none, as far as I can tell, that are immune to the tortured effect, so you can give enemies who are otherwise immune disadvantage on con saves, which is at least marginally interesting. So I think you could maybe do something cool with this weapon if you wanted to build around like a reverberation build that also does con save targeting effects, but for the most part I think there's just better options. You're just giving up too much damage and a hit chance and everything in order to use the Jagged Spear. I'm going to give it C tier because I think you could try some stuff with it, but I don't think that stuff is overall going to be that powerful. Next up, the Light of Creation. The Light of Creation is a +1 halberd that does an extra d6 of lightning damage, which is pretty good stats for an Act 1 weapon. An extra d6 of lightning damage is not bad, and a +1 halberd is a pretty decent weapon for something to be. However, it comes with a drawback. Whenever you attack with this weapon, you have to make a DC 10 Constitution save or become stunned, which obviously is a brutal and debilitating condition, unless you are a construct. Now, most characters in Baldur's Gate aren't constructs. However, there is one way to become a construct, which is the Gloves of the Automaton in Act 2. By Act 2, though, this weapon is pretty outclassed. You will definitely have better weapons to use in Act 2. So the only real use case for this weapon is as an Act 1 weapon for a character that can reliably pass a DC 10 con save. That's not that difficult to do. A character with 16 Constitution and con save proficiency has a +5 bonus. If you then add like a +1 or 2 to saving throws from items and advantage on con saves from items, you can get this pretty reliable, especially if you're like a halfling or something like that. But that's a lot of hoops to jump through for a weapon that's not that much better than other weapons available at this point. For that reason, I think that the Light of Creation is just too much work to build around, and by the time you get the item that's intended to combo with it, the Gloves of the Automaton, which turns you into a construct for 10 turns, and is a very good item, you're just going to have better weapons to use. I'm going to give it C tier because a character that can reliably pass the con save does get a decent weapon out of it, albeit with some risk. But overall, again, I think that this weapon is just too risky and too dangerous for most characters to want to jump through the hoops to make it work. Next up, one of the buggiest items in the entire game, the Lightning Jabber. The Lightning Jabber is a deceptively simple-looking weapon. It is a +1 spear that inflicts shocked when you hit an enemy with it, and also, when you throw it at an enemy, does an extra d4 of lightning damage. However, the tooltip here is pretty misleading because it doesn't inflict shocked, it inflicts shocking grasp, which is a different effect that prevents enemies from taking reactions. So when you hit an enemy with it, they have to make a DC 13 con save or they can't take reactions for a turn. Also, when thrown at an enemy, it does an extra d4 of lightning damage. That d4 of lightning damage is special because on Tactician mode or below, it is both a damage rider and a damage rider source. If you don't know what that means, just think extremely buggy. What that means is that if you have Tavern Brawler or the Ring of Flinging on Tactician mode or below, the Lightning Jabber extra d4 of damage will apply your Tavern Brawler bonus again. It'll apply the Ring of Flinging bonus again. The Ring of Flinging will then apply the Lightning Jabber bonus again, which will apply the Tavern Brawler bonus again. So this item lets you stack ludicrous amounts of damage because of bugs in the way that damage is calculated. These bugs have been fixed for Honor mode. So on Honor mode, it just does the extra d4 of damage, your Tavern Brawler damage, and your Ring of Flinging damage as normal when thrown. But on Tactician mode or below, the Lightning Jabber is absolutely broken because of the poor structure of how damage is calculated in Baldur's Gate. It also has some other fun bugs, like for example, if you dip it in a surface, it removes the surface, but still gets the coating. So like if you dip it in fire, it lights on fire, but removes the fire surface for some reason. And also, even though it's a spear, it doesn't work with the polearm master feat. So this weapon, despite its relatively simple effect, is just a pile of bugs all the way down. The upshot in Honor mode is that it is a pretty good throwing weapon for an Eldritch Knight. The extra d4 of lightning damage is pretty good, and when you're an Eldritch Knight, you can bind it, and then it will return to you, making it a pretty good option as a throwing weapon for an Eldritch Knight in the early game. It is more damage on average than the returning Pike if you have the ability to give it returning, and so for the Eldritch Knight who would be using it, it's going to be better. If you're not an Eldritch Knight, then it is worse because the returning Pike will return, making it a more useful early game throwing weapon. But for an Eldritch Knight in particular, the Lightning Jabber is going to be best in slot in Act 1. On Tactician mode or below, it's far and away the best throwing weapon because of all the aforementioned bugs. Either way, the Lightning Jabber gets S tier because in Honor mode, Eldritch Knights want to use this over the other available options in the early game. Next up, the Merregon Halberd. The Merregon Halberd is just a +1 halberd with no special effects. It has a cool icon, but other than that, it's pretty useless because it's identical to a weapon you could already have had, and that you've chosen not to. D tier. The Monster Slayer Glaive. The Monster Slayer Glaive is a +1 glaive that gives you an extra d4 to your attack and damage against monstrosity-type enemies. So if you're fighting, for example, phase fighters, which are monstrosities, then this may very well be the best two-handed weapon that you have available at this point in the game. +1d4 to hit and +1d4 to damage is a massive bonus for an encounter, and being a +1 glaive, it's on par with other available weapons. In addition to that, it gives you 5 feet of additional jump distance, which for melee characters is extremely relevant, because if you're a strength character, the extra 5 feet of jump distance stacks on top of your already excellent jump to give you a lot more mobility. However, the real bonus of the Monster Slayer Glaive is that the passive effects apply whether or not you're actually using it as a weapon. The extra d4 to attack rolls and damage rolls applies to any ranged weapon you have equipped alongside the Monster Slayer Glaive. And so an archer can use this when fighting monstrosities for an enormous bonus while still using the Titan String bow or whatever powerful bow they want to have equipped. It's especially good with dual hand crossbows because you apply the bonus to hit and the bonus to damage even more often. +5 feet of bonus to jump distance is also very useful to archers who often want to get up high where enemies can't get to them, or spellcasters for the same reason, especially because those characters will often have low strength, and so the additional jump distance can be the difference between actually gaining distance by jumping and losing distance. That is a pretty powerful set of effects. Admittedly, only useful in certain encounters, but very, very good for those encounters, so I'm going to give the Monster Slayer Glaive A tier, +1d4 bonus to attack and damage in some pretty dangerous early game encounters is a huge bonus, and you should definitely keep an eye out for this weapon for that reason. The Returning Pike. The Returning Pike is a +1 pike that comes back when you throw it. It also has the thrown weapon property, allowing it to do its full weapon damage when thrown. A weapon that comes back when you throw it is obviously really powerful for a thrown weapon character. It means you always have a weapon equipped. When you throw that weapon, it will re-equip to your character, and you can just throw it again. Throwing weapons are obviously some of the most powerful strategies in Baldur's Gate 3, and the Returning Pike is the first returning weapon that you get access to. I do want to take a moment to think about sort of how ridiculous a throwing pike is as a concept. I already mentioned that pikes are sort of between 12 and 28 feet in length, and the idea of chucking this enormously long piece of wood and having it actually go where you throw it is just a very funny mental image. That being said, this is a magical weapon, so we'll give it a pass on the realism front, but it is just a very funny mental picture to imagine somebody hurling a pike and actually getting it to go where they want. The Returning Pike is going to be the best in slot weapon for any throwing character that isn't an Eldritch Knight. An Eldritch Knight is going to prefer the Lightning Jabber in general, because it just is more damage than the Returning Pike. 1d6 plus 1d4 is, on average, more than 1d10. But the Returning Pike is going to be absolutely the best throwing weapon for any character that isn't an Eldritch Knight and doesn't have the returning property built into their weapons. For that reason, it's going to go in S tier. It is the best weapon for what is probably overall the best strategy in Baldur's Gate 3, and is going to be just a mainstay of any party that includes a thrown weapon barbarian or other thrown weapon character. In addition to that, it's also just a +1 pike that you can buy very early from a merchant, which with a bunch of extra properties. So even for a melee character, a +1 pike is not a bad weapon, and having the option to throw it and have it come back and then still be able to make melee attacks with it later on is totally reasonable. So even parties without dedicated throwers will still probably want this weapon, but obviously the main use is for thrown weapon characters. Next up, Sorrow. Sorrow is a +1 glaive with a really cool magical ability that's honestly somewhat difficult to rate for this tier list, because you can either get it right at the beginning of the game through pickpocketing, or much later in Act 1 by completing a quest. It's a +1 glaive, which means if you get it right from the beginning of the game, it's going to be one of the best weapons you have access to even before considering its ability, which lets you cast Sorrowful Lash as a bonus action at will, once per turn. Sorrowful Lash does a d4 of damage plus your spellcasting modifier, which is interesting because it's sort of a cantrip that adds your spellcasting modifier to damage, and pulls an enemy 10 feet towards you. It's 30-foot range. So it's basically Thorn Whip, but castable as a bonus action, and that adds your spellcasting modifier to damage. That ability is really cool and really powerful. Pulling enemies towards you can be used in all kinds of cool situations, to pull them across spike growth for extra damage, to pull them off of ledges so you can get to them with your melee characters, to pull them into pits that they are standing on the other side of from you. So there's all sorts of really powerful effects that you can do with pulling enemies, and the fact that it's a bonus action means that melee characters, who may in the early game not always have a super relevant bonus action to do, get a really strong bonus action with Sorrow. Because this is a +1 glaive, if you get it through the pickpocketing route and get it right away, a +1 glaive with a powerful magical ability, it's obviously going to be S tier. So I'm going to put it in S tier for that use case. If you get it later in Act 1, after completing the Druid Grove questline, it's a little less interesting, because by this point you probably have some other good weapon options, but the effect of pulling enemies towards you is still really cool, and you can definitely make builds around that. So even if you get this, I guess, not as intended, because pickpocketing is an intended mechanic, but as a quest reward, then it's still going to be an A tier weapon, but I'm giving it S tier based on how early it is possible to get this item. Next, one of my very favorite weapons in the game, the Skinburster, which also, of course, is my favorite single by DJ Helm. The Skinburster is a +1 halberd that whenever you deal damage with it, you get 2 turns of Force Conduit. Force Conduit is a condition, sort of like Reverberation or Radiating Orbs, except it's beneficial for your character. It can stack up to 7 times, and for every stack that you have remaining, it goes down by 1 every turn. For every stack that you have remaining, you reduce physical damage against you by 1. So bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage against you is reduced by 1, up to -7 to all physical damage. If you have 5 or more stacks and you get hit, you deal a d4 of force damage to everything within 20 feet of you, setting up for some pretty powerful retaliation damage. It's very easy to stack up to 7 Force Conduit with the Skinburster. A normal character making attacks with this weapon will make 2 attacks per turn, and that's 4 stacks right there, and so on turn 2 you've got 7 stacks. But also, this is a halberd, meaning that it has by default the cleave weapon action, hitting up to 3 enemies, and that will stack you 6 stacks in a single action. It's even easier if you are a sword bard, or Tiger Barbarian, or other character that can attack multiple enemies with a single attack by default. The Tiger Barbarian's Rage allows it to slash in a big arc, hitting up to 3 enemies, basically the same as Cleave, and so that character can stack the Skinburster up to 7 in a single turn very quickly, similar to Sword Bard that can hit 2 enemies with an attack and stack it up to 7 in a single turn of attacks. The Skinburster therefore gives you a ton of damage reduction, and a character that hits you back is going to take a bunch of damage. It's available near the end of Act 1, so you won't be able to use it for a lot of Act 1, but the amount of damage reduction that this gives you is going to make the wielder more or less invincible. It also stacks extremely well with other sources of damage reduction. Let's say the Heavy Armor Master feat with the Adamantine Splint Mail, that's 5 additional damage reduction for a total of -12 damage that you're taking. Or an Abjuration Wizard with Force Conduit on it can have even more damage reduction, so a character can become very, very difficult to kill through physical damage, even if they get hit. It's especially good for barbarians, Tiger Barbarians in particular, because Reckless Attack will cause enemies to focus their attacks on you, since they have advantage on those attacks, taking the return damage and dealing almost no damage to you, because they'll be doing half damage, because Rage reduces physical damage by half, and then the damage will be reduced even further by Force Conduit. There's so many cool combos with this weapon. Tiger Barbarians in particular make great use of it, but it's also just by default a really powerful weapon for any character that wants to be up there brawling. And so I'm going to give it S tier. It's part of a very powerful set of builds and also enables a bunch of other cool builds, so S tier for the Skinburster. Next up, the Watcher's Guide. The Watcher's Guide is, depending on your route through the game, quite possibly the first magical weapon that you encounter in a given playthrough, except for the one that you can get on the Nautiloid. The Watcher's Guide is a magical spear, but with no enhancement bonus. But whenever you miss an attack with this weapon, you gain True Strike on your next attack roll against that enemy. So if you miss an attack, you get advantage on your next attack. That's a reasonable upgrade over a default non-magical weapon, and since you're going to get this very, very early in the game, possibly before you get to the Goblin Camp or whatever, I think that most parties are going to pick it up and just put it on a character. I usually end up with Shadowheart using it for one fight before she swaps to a different weapon if I'm bringing a cleric or something, and so the Watcher's Guide will see a reasonable amount of play. It's certainly not a weapon that you're excited about, the effect is not particularly good, but in the very, very early game, you get this item so early, it will be better than just a non-magical weapon. I'm going to give it B tier because you'll swap out of it almost immediately, but it is worth picking up at least and using for like 1, maybe 2 encounters. The Unseen Menace. The Unseen Menace is a +1 pike that is invisible. An invisible weapon, or the invisible weapon because it's the only one, means that you have advantage with every attack that you make with this weapon, until you miss an attack. When you miss an attack, it loses this property for 2 turns, and you no longer have advantage on every attack. It also critical hits on a 19 or a 20, so it adds +1 to your chance of critical hitting. You don't lose the bonus to critical hit chance when you miss with an attack. Advantage on every single attack that you make with a weapon, obviously, is incredibly powerful. This is the first source in the game of just permanent passive advantage for your party, I think. And so, pretty much any character that wants advantage, which is every character that's attacking with a weapon, is going to be very happy to use this weapon. The bonus to critical hit chance is also very relevant, especially for the types of characters that benefit most from advantage. The natural user for the Unseen Menace is a paladin. This, having advantage on every attack and critically hitting more often means more critical smites, which of course is what paladins want to do most of all. You double the damage of your smite dice when you critical hit, and so if you get a lot of criticals because you're attacking with advantage, making criticals more likely, and you have bonus critical hit chance, making criticals more likely, then you're going to get to one-shot enemies with critical hit smites vastly more often than with any other weapon. In addition to that, this is a pike, meaning that it has the brace weapon action by default, making it even better for paladins, because when you brace with the weapon, you can reroll the damage dice, including your smite dice. The Unseen Menace, therefore, is going to be the best weapon for paladins in the early game. The reach is also pretty useful. It's also very, very good for a sentinel weapon user. The advantage is a little wasted because you gain advantage on opportunity attacks with Sentinel, but the reach, of course, is very good. And so this character is going to be able to just critically hit more often, and smite maximally often, which is exactly what a paladin wants to do. S tier, best weapon in the game for paladins at the point when you get it. And finally, for Act 1 polearms, the Vision of the Absolute. The Vision of the Absolute is a spear with no enhancement bonus, so just a normal spear in terms of damage and hit chance. But when you hit an enemy with it, they have to make a DC 11 dexterity saving throw or become blind. Blind is a really powerful effect to inflict on hit. Blind is just a super powerful debuff. But DC 11 dex save is a pretty bad save. Dex save is the second worst to target usually. Most enemies have pretty good dexterity saving throws in Baldur's Gate. And DC 11 obviously is not very high, so most enemies are going to succeed on this save. That being said, it's passive, which makes it more or less free value, which is always good. In addition to that effect, it does an extra 2d6 piercing damage to enemies with multiple sets of eyes. In this case, spiders and spectators. I think those are the only types of enemies that this triggers against. And 3d6 damage from your weapon attack is pretty good. Important to note that even though this is a spear and has the thrown property, neither of these effects trigger when you throw the weapon. So you won't blind enemies and you won't get the extra 2d6 damage when thrown. That would make it really good. As is, it's still quite good for fights where it's going to work. So there's one early game fight in Act 1 where you're going to be fighting some spider-like enemies, in which case the Vision of the Absolute is really good. And also it's just a pretty powerful effect that you can apply just whenever you hit an enemy. This is going to be a pretty solid upgrade to whatever weapon you're using, because you can get it very, very early in the game. So for a character that's got simple weapon proficiency and wants a decent magical weapon in the early game, the Vision of the Absolute is probably going to be your go-to. The ability to apply blind on a dex save is relevant throughout the game, though the fact that this is a spear with no enhancement bonus definitely makes it less exciting, as well as the low saving throw. But still, overall, when you get this item, it's going to be quite solid, and it's very good in certain early game encounters. I'm going to give it A tier, though admittedly this is A tier based on its use in just a couple encounters in the game, and you will, as soon as you get out of Act 1, pretty quickly forget about this weapon. So, at the end of Act 1, you can see why I say this is one of the most powerful weapon categories in Baldur's Gate 3, with 5 weapons in S tier, and relevant weapons even at lower tiers. By the end of Act 1, if you're using an Eldritch Knight thrower, they'll be using the Lightning Jabber, and any other thrower will be using the Returning Pike. Sorrow will have been useful for most of Act 1, but probably swapped out by the end of Act 1 for a stronger weapon, though the bonus action Thorn Whip is still a really cool ability, so some parties may get quite a bit of use out of it, even later on into the game. The Skinburster will go on tanks, and especially Tigerheart Barbarians, and Paladins will be using the Unseen Menace, so a wide variety of characters will want to be using various polearms. Alright, let's go to Act 2. Moving on to Act 2, the Drakethroat Glaive. This is a +2 glaive, so already a pretty powerful weapon with a +2 enhancement bonus even before you get to its magical abilities. It has 2. The first of these is that enemies have disadvantage on your Dragonborn breath weapon saving throws when you're carrying this weapon. Even if you are playing a Dragonborn, at this point your breath weapon will have been mostly outscaled by simply making weapon attacks or casting spells, so that's not going to come up that often, but if you're doing some kind of Dragonborn theme build, then obviously you're going to want this weapon. The important ability, though, is Draconic Elemental Weapon, which lets you, once per long rest, cast, effectively, Elemental Weapon on your main hand weapon. If cast on the Drakethroat Glaive, this turns it from a +2 weapon into a +3 weapon and adds a d4 of damage, either acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder, so a d4 of elemental damage. Generally speaking, you're going to be best off with cold damage because you can double it with the wet condition, but of course if you have reverberation synergy or something like that, then thunder damage or lightning damage could also be very, very useful. The real key with this weapon, though, is that even so when you cast this on the Drakethroat Glaive, it's going to turn it into a +3 weapon because it adds +1 to its enhancement bonus and give it an extra d4 of damage. And a +3 glaive with an extra d4 of elemental damage, like cold damage, for example, is already an incredible two-handed weapon at this point. So you may, on two-handed weapon characters, just end up using the Drakethroat Glaive as a normal weapon. The real key with this weapon, though, is that you don't have to cast Draconic Elemental Weapon on the glaive itself. By putting another weapon on the ground, you can cast it on that weapon, and it will just have the Elemental Weapon enchantment for the entire day. You can also use it on your ranged weapon if you're a melee character. And so you can use the Elemental Weapon spell from this weapon on any weapon that you want to equip on a character for a free +1 enhancement bonus and 1d4 extra elemental damage on that weapon. This requires no investment because you can just carry the Drakethroat Glaive and use it, so it's effectively a free cast of Elemental Weapon, which is a pretty strong spell, only available as a level 3 spell to Paladin, so normally you have to be level 9 to cast it. Just for literally no investment, because this weapon just sits in your inventory and provides the benefit passively. I mean, you know how I feel about free value. So on top of this already being just an incredible weapon in and of itself, it makes all the other good weapons that you have access to even better. The only difficult decision with the Drakethroat Glaive is which character is going to get the bonus, because the bonus is incredibly powerful and free, so every character is going to want it. And the answer is pretty much whichever character is making the most attacks in a given round should get the Drakethroat Glaive buff, because then they'll apply it the most times in a turn, so you'll get the most value out of it. The Drakethroat Glaive, because it's both a super powerful weapon in itself, though rarely used for its actual weapon properties, and also because it just improves your party dramatically without investing any resources in it, is obviously an S-tier weapon, and any player who's optimizing is going to be using this weapon all the time throughout their entire playthrough. The Halberd of Vigilance. The Halberd of Vigilance is a +2 halberd that also does an additional 1d4 of force damage on every attack. Notably, of course, it's acquired at the same point as the Drakethroat Glaive, so if you enchant it with the Drakethroat Glaive enchantment, then it becomes a +3 halberd that does 2d4 of extra damage on every attack. In addition to the just being a solid weapon from its base stats, it also gives you a +1 bonus to your initiative checks, which of course is very, very powerful, initiative being the most important stat in Honor mode, and advantage on perception checks, which is a little bit less useful. It also gives you advantage on every attack you make as a reaction. So if you are making opportunity attacks, if you are making riposte attacks as a Battlemaster fighter, the Halberd of Vigilance gives you advantage on those attacks, making them much more likely to hit. Being a +2 halberd with a bonus to damage and a really relevant ability, the Halberd of Vigilance is just the best two-handed weapon that you have access to at this point in the game. There's a couple others that are sort of actual great weapons, and the Skinburster can compete in some ways, but for most characters that want a two-handed weapon, the Halberd of Vigilance is going to be the best in slot when you get it, because its stats are so good. Unlike other weapons that give bonuses to initiative, I don't recommend putting this on an archer just for the initiative bonus, because it requires both your hands, so you can't use it in addition to another sort of passive main hand stat stick. But that is an option if you want to use that, but mostly the Halberd of Vigilance is good just because it's a great weapon with a +2 enchantment bonus and a bunch of relevant abilities that any character that wants to swing a halberd around is going to want to use it. S tier for the Halberd of Vigilance. The Harmonium Halberd. The Harmonium Halberd is a +1 halberd that gives you +2 to your strength up to a maximum of 23, and -1 to your intelligence and wisdom. For characters that would want to use this, the -1 to intelligence is probably not that relevant, but -1 to your wisdom probably decreases your wisdom saving throws, and so can be a pretty severe penalty since those are often a pain point for martial characters. Like every other effect that increases your strength in Baldur's Gate 3, the Harmonium Halberd is competing with the Elixirs of Strength, which can raise your strength to more than 23 for free without having to spend your weapon slot on it. So only a character that is using their natural strength would want to use the Harmonium Halberd, and many strength characters may prefer to be using elixirs depending on exactly how you've structured your party for that playthrough. If you are using your natural strength, the Harmonium Halberd is effectively a +2 halberd available early in Act 2 that gives you a -1 to all of your wisdom saving throws. As a weapon that's okay, it might be better than some of the other weapons available to you at this point, but by the beginning of Act 2 you should have some pretty decent weapon options, and so a +2 halberd, which isn't that exciting without a real magical effect, that also decreases your wisdom saves, is not something that I'm that interested in. You might get some value out of this if you need strength specifically for something, like maybe you're an Elk Totem Barbarian whose strength matters for their other actions rather than just their weapon attacks, but for the most part, the Harmonium Halberd, I think, is not going to see that much play. C tier. The Moonlight Glaive. The Moonlight Glaive is a +2 glaive that deals an extra d4 of radiant damage on every attack, and also gives you the Moonlight Butterflies ability once per short rest. Moonlight Butterflies lets you add your proficiency bonus to your damage twice, because for some reason it adds your proficiency bonus in psychic damage and your proficiency bonus in slashing damage to the attack. I assume this is a bug and it wasn't supposed to do it twice, but it does. So for most characters, it's going to be +8 damage on the Moonlight Butterfly's attack. And then enemies that you hit with this effect create a 7-foot radius AoE where you have advantage on attacks against them, and if they leave, they take a d6 of psychic damage. This is a pretty complicated ability for basically just once per short rest, you deal extra damage and get advantage on future attacks against that enemy. The main usage of this item, the extra burst damage is fine, +8 damage is not a ton, but is relevant. But the main usage of this item is just that it's a two-handed weapon that deals radiant damage. It's a +2 glaive with an additional d4 of damage, so just like the Halberd of Vigilance, that's just pretty good in and of itself. And the Moonlight Butterfly's ability is fine, but for the most part, I think that the Moonlight Glaive is going to be simply outclassed by the Drakethroat Glaive, by the Halberd of Vigilance, or by an earlier weapon that's been enchanted with the Drakethroat Glaive. The main use for this character is if you're doing like a Radiating Orb Paladin build, for example, and you want specifically a weapon that does radiant damage, then the Moonlight Glaive could be pretty useful. But for most characters, the Halberd of Vigilance, which you get earlier, is just going to be better. I'm going to give it B tier because obviously Radiating Orb is a pretty powerful effect, but this isn't the best way to do radiant damage on your attacks anyways. And I'm not that impressed by the short rest weapon action. Next up, the two legendary polearms, Selune's Spear of Night and Shar's Spear of Evening. I'm going to talk about these individually, but I wanted to mention them together because they are mutually exclusive. As a quest reward for the two alternate ways of doing a quest, you can only ever have one or the other under most circumstances. Selune's Spear of Night is a +3 spear with several magical effects. The first of these is you get advantage on wisdom saving throws, always relevant and pretty useful for most characters. Though, since this is kind of intended as a cleric weapon, that character may not need it as much as other characters. You also get Dark Vision, which is mostly useless, the ability to cast Moonbeam once per long rest, which is fine. It's a level 3 version of Moonbeam for a little bit of damage, and Moonbeam isn't a bad spell, but at this point in the game you probably have better uses for your actions. The extra resources will go some way, but so far, not that exciting. The real prize of this weapon, though, is the weapon action Moonmote. Once per long rest, you can enchant a 60-foot radius around you. Allies inside of that radius deal an extra d4 radiant damage on every one of their melee attacks. And enemies inside of the radius must have to make a wisdom saving throw at the start of each of their turns, or they treat the area as difficult terrain. This also counts as applying an effect just when you cast it to enemies. So if you have items that care about applying effects to enemies, you get to do this, and they don't even have to fail the saving throw in order to receive the effect of the Moonmote ability. So you get stacks of reverb and Radiating Orb just by activating this ability. Moonmote obviously is a truly very powerful ability. Increasing the radiant damage of your allies is massive, especially in a summon party. This is a very, very powerful effect, but it is only once per long rest, and otherwise, honestly, Selune's Spear of Night is not that exciting a weapon. A +3 spear is obviously very good, but you could be using a +2 one-handed weapon and enchanting it with the Drakethroat Glaive for a +3 weapon, and there are just other weapons that deal a lot more damage than this one, so only in the encounter when you're actually activating Moonmote is Selune's Spear of Night particularly good, and that is only once per day. It's a little bit disappointing, but I'm going to give this weapon A tier because while it is very, very good in one encounter per day, it's not that good in the other encounters. And so overall, I think that this is an A tier weapon that you want to swap with a more powerful weapon when you're not using it. Of course, you can just carry it for the flavor, and the +3 spear is still a totally respectable weapon, don't get me wrong, but for a legendary weapon, I would want it to be powerful all day, not just once a day. Shar's Spear of Evening, on the other hand, is a +3 spear with wildly more powerful abilities. This spear has so many different abilities that, honestly, I just keep finding new ones whenever I play with this weapon. Firstly, you get advantage on all saving throws if you are not in a fully lit area. So if you're lightly or heavily obscured, you get advantage on all your saving throws. That includes Constitution saves, which of course helps with your concentration checks if you're using this on a cleric. If an enemy is lightly or heavily obscured, this weapon deals an extra d6 of damage to them on every attack. So if you're fighting in darkness, then you're going to deal an extra d6 of damage to every enemy, which obviously is very powerful on a +3 weapon. In addition, you can't be blinded, which basically gives you an improved version of the Devil's Sight Warlock Pact, which is one of the most powerful things that you can do in Baldur's Gate 3. It lets you shoot into clouds of darkness without penalty as though they weren't there, not be blinded in darkness, fight inside fog cloud without being blinded. So basically you get to abuse darkness on a character that's not a warlock when you're using this weapon. Darkness is one of the most powerful things in Baldur's Gate 3, so that's incredibly powerful, and entire parties are built around abusing that ability. In addition, you get a cast of darkness that is that you can cast at will, which of course is ridiculously powerful. You just get as much darkness as you want to spend actions on, and a weapon action that you can use once per short rest to hit every enemy in a large AoE around you and summon a cloud of darkness. So basically you get to cast a level 2 spell and make a weapon attack in the same turn. All of these abilities together make this one of the absolute best weapons in the game. Any character can use this for incredible effect, but darkness-focused parties will obviously get even more value out of it. It is especially exciting for shadow monks who can use the effect of it to be able to fight in their own darkness effects much more powerfully. The sheer amount of things that you can do with the Spear of Evening just makes it unbelievably powerful and a mainstay of a wide array of builds and strategies. S tier, of course, for Shar's Spear of Evening. The Spear of Night is a story weapon. It's a +1 spear with no other magical effect, so it's, at this point in the game, for its use as a weapon, going to go in D tier. It's only there because it's a story weapon. So, at the end of Act 2, if you've gone the story route that gets you Shar's Spear of Evening, you've picked up what might be the single best weapon in the entire game, in terms of actually using it as a weapon. In addition, your party has gotten vastly more powerful, because you now have access to the Drakethroat Glaive, which just buffs up anything that you're doing. Any party can use this, pretty much no matter what they're doing. And two-handed weapon users have gotten a nice solid upgrade in the Halberd of Vigilance. If you went the story route that gets you Selune's Spear, then you'll swap it in for one encounter a day for the very, very powerful Moonmote ability. And a couple other characters have gotten other options, but mostly the winners here are going to be these 4 weapons. Alright, let's talk Act 3. I've included the +2 spear here because the only guaranteed location I know to get it is in Act 3, but it's right at the very, very end of the game. I think this can spawn in merchant inventories, but don't buy it because you can get much better spears from story events in Act 2. D tier. The Breaching Pikestaff. The Breaching Pikestaff is a +2 pike that deals an extra d4 of force damage. Otherwise, it has no magical effect. This is obviously just worse than the Halberd of Vigilance. It's worse than using the Drakethroat Glaive as a weapon. It's worse than using the Moonlight Glaive most of the time. So the Breaching Pikestaff is just not going to be that exciting. In Act 3, you have way better weapons. D tier. Next up, the Hellbeard Halberd. I have to say, I love the name Hellbeard Halberd. It's just very fun to say. Personally, if I was designing the icon for this, it would reference a bearded axe more visually, but Hellbeard Halberd is just a really great name for an item, so kudos to the flavor team that came up with that one. As an item, it's a +2 halberd that deals an extra 6 poison damage on every attack. Not a d6 of poison damage, but specifically 6. 6 is probably more on average than you'll get with an extra d6 of poison damage, for example, even though you can double the d6 with critical hits, because a halberd user probably won't be heavily spec'd into critically hitting, so even if you have things like that increase your damage dice, like extra critical hit chance, the +6 poison damage is probably better than a d6 would be. In addition to that effect, it poisons enemies on every attack. So if you hit an enemy with this weapon, they become poisoned unless they're immune, no saving throw. Poisoned gives enemies disadvantage on attack rolls, which is a pretty powerful effect, and also just is, as we've talked about, an effect, a condition that you apply on every single attack without a saving throw, which is pretty powerful. The Hellbeard Halberd is not a bad damage weapon in and of itself. The damage on this weapon is quite good. And the fact that it applies poisoned on every attack makes it pretty good at debuffing enemies who aren't immune to poisoned. Obviously, a lot of Act 3 enemies are, but a surprising number of them aren't, and the Hellbeard Halberd can really do a number on them by giving them disadvantage on their attacks. So for longer boss fights, this weapon can be a pretty powerful effect to keep your party alive by giving enemies disadvantage. I think that this weapon is it also, of course, has synergy with the items that care about poisoning, the poisoner's item set. The ability to just apply poisoned on every attack, can heal you, can deal extra damage, and so on. So that is also not bad in and of itself. For that reason, I'm going to give it A tier, because I think that this actually is a viable alternative for some boss fights where enemies aren't immune to poison, and having them have disadvantage on all their attacks can really help keep your party alive. I think that this is a little generous, but I think that this item has enough applications that it belongs in A tier rather than B tier, though I will say it's at the lower end of A tier. Pretty cool weapon that has a bunch of stuff going for it, because anything that doesn't have a saving throw is always pretty cool. The Infernal Spear. The Infernal Spear is a +1 spear that deals 3 poison damage, and unlike the Hellbeard Halberd, doesn't poison enemies on every attack. So at this point in the game, obviously, you've got at least one spear that's way, way better than the Infernal Spear in most playthroughs. And so, unless you're doing something very specific with poisoned weapons, you wouldn't want this. And even then, I think there are better options for characters that care about poison, so D tier for the Infernal Spear. The Magical Pike is just a normal +1 pike that, for some reason, has a different name. So obviously, in Act 3, a +1 weapon has no use. D tier. And finally, the last of polearms, the Dancing Breeze. The Dancing Breeze is a +2 glaive that, once per short rest, lets you use Whirlwind Attack to attack every enemy in a 10-foot radius around you. Just to remind you, glaives by default don't get cleave, so this adds an AoE option to a weapon type that normally wouldn't have it. In addition to that, the Dancing Breeze is a finesse weapon, allowing you to use your dexterity bonus instead of your strength to attack with it. The fact that this is a two-handed polearm that's also a finesse weapon opens up a bunch of really, really cool options. As a finesse weapon, the Dancing Breeze lets you be a dexterity-based character that has Polearm Master, or Sentinel, or something like that, and attack using those feats, or in fact both, while getting to use the best stat in the game as your main stat. That's pretty cool for a lot of characters, and makes a lot of more defensively oriented characters, like a Sentinel Paladin, for example, much more viable because they have access to this weapon. You probably will need to do some respecking in order to make use of this weapon, or switch from a sword and board style with a one-handed finesse weapon to the Dancing Breeze once you get access to it. Because you don't get this weapon until late, it's hard to build around it for the entire game. But it enables such cool options, and so many builds work that wouldn't work if this item didn't exist, that I think it's awesome that it's in the game. It's A tier because it enables a bunch of really cool builds. Obviously, it's a slightly weaker item than a lot of the S tier items, but there are many fairly powerful builds that just wouldn't work without it, which brings it into A tier as a really interesting option. So, at the end of Act 3, polearms are a really interesting weapon type because unlike most other weapons, they really get their power spike in Act 2, which I think is also part of what makes them such a good kind of weapon, because Act 2 is when a lot of characters struggle to find good gear, but polearm users find some of the absolute best gear in the game. In Act 3, you get a couple other interesting options. You can do a poison build with the Hellbeard Halberd and bring it in for certain fights, and characters that want a dexterity-based two-handed option and a dexterity-based polearm get one in the Dancing Breeze, but most characters will still be using the incredibly powerful weapons that you got in Act 2. You can see why I say this is one of the best weapon categories in the game, with 8 S-tier weapons and a bunch of other really important weapons, and the A-tier weapons are also very good in this weapon category. I sometimes get questions about, how can you have 8 weapons in S tier? Well, they're all best in slot for the characters that want them, so of course they go in S tier. Shar's Spear of Evening is on the shortlist for the absolute best weapon in the entire game, as is the Drakethroat Glaive, for different reasons, though probably the Drakethroat Glaive actually is the best weapon in the game, because you don't have to use your weapon slot on getting its advantage. But other than that, you also get a ton of really powerful options for a wide variety of characters. As always, if you think that I misplaced something in this tier list, or you think there's something I should move around, definitely do let me know in the comments. I'm always open to moving things around based on good arguments and feedback in the comments. So if you think that I misunderstood something about one of these weapons or misplaced it for whatever reason, please do let me know. And of course, if you have enjoyed the video, feel free to leave any kind of comment and hit like on the video. Helps me out with the algorithm, so I appreciate you taking the time to do that very much. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 build guides. We're almost through with all the weapons, which is pretty exciting, and other strategy game content. Cheers, my friends. I will catch you next time.